I'm going to talk about various things today, but the main take-home point, which I'll give at the beginning to sort of focus the attention a bit, is that thinking in terms of social networks is a way of avoiding a council of despair. It's a way of realizing that there's no such thing as individual behavior change. Any behavior change that you make on the basis of what you understand the problem to be is infectious, contagious, and has effects well beyond yourself. So the main thing to remember is when you think, what's the point in getting energy efficiency light bulbs or driving with more fuel efficiency, just remember that you have impact beyond yourself, and that what we're about to talk about speaks to that. Okay, brief word about where I'm from. I left a few of our recent journals out by that desk that has the wonderful, alluring stuff on it. I thought I'd add to that. The full name of my organization is as above. This is a kind of historical artifact, a bit like HSBC. We don't kind of speak a lot about our actual, what our name stands for. We call ourselves the RSA because we don't do much about, fine arts, certainly. And manufacturers and commerce are, while they were very important at the beginning of the organization, are no longer central. Most of our work now is about human capability, about understanding how to use social tools and technology more generally to solve social problems. Our strapline is a slightly grand one, but quite befitting to the Garrison Institute, 21st Century Enlightenment. A lot of people rolled their eyes when that became our strapline because we had to speak on behalf of it. But the quotation that put me at ease slightly was this by Foucault on Kant's description of the Enlightenment. Of course, not the 21st Century Enlightenment, but the previous one. It's an attitude in which the critique of what we are is at one and the same time the historical analysis of the limits that are imposed on us and the possibility of going beyond them. So that's kind of what I want to speak to here. Quite a few of us realize this already, that information is not working, that the facts don't do it. So the question is why exactly? I thought this way of putting it was particularly elegant, that the frequency of a chime is beyond the threshold of human hearing. And Colin Hamilton wrote a beautiful book, basically speaking all about the reasons we can't face up to climate change. And more recently, we've had work about immunity to change more generally in organizations and individuals, telling us that actually often our attempts to solve a problem are part of what keeps it going. And I'm mentioning this now because we very often think with climate change, you just need to throw everything at it. You just need to give it the technology, give it the behavior. You get this wedge here, that wedge there. We also need to be aware of there are times when there are countervailing motions, where the attempt to, for example, encourage people to save money, appealing to their economic interest, may in fact reinforce that economic interest elsewhere when it actually leads them to cause more environmental problems than you solved in the first instance. So there are many cases where we just need to be aware of this fact, that we need to be a bit more discerning. Immunity is fleshed out by Robert Keegan and Lisa Lahey in a beautiful book, but more in lots of workshops they've done with people. And I believe there's some efforts afoot to get Robert Keegan here to the Garrison Institute to speak more about that. The Common Cause report hit me like a juggernaut, actually. It's not the core of my talk, but I imagine many people here have read it. Because I think it speaks to the deep changes that Dan was speaking about this morning, that most of us feel we need, but most of us also probably think we can't possibly achieve in time. The kind of collective transformation of the human psyche that we sort of yearn for, but also at some level can't yet fully believe in. At least I may speak for myself there, but that's where we are. And we've got to think about how we can move beyond that. This is a rough and ready idea of why I'm speaking about habits and networks. I'll try and avoid going in front of that. Reach is fair enough. There was Jonathan Rose sent me an email some while ago saying that climate change hasn't been covered on the main nightly news very much. And that's a problem of reach. The information is not hitting as many people. So that's one challenge. But even if you got massive reach, we know there is resistances. People will filter it in their own way. And you have engagement. So if you may have a climate website, I'm sure many of you have, where you measure what you care about, not the people who are coming to your website, but whether they're actually engaging in it. Whether they're giving comments, whether they're buying things, whether they're in any way sort of giving you any kickback or feedback. And then you have influence, where you actually begin to feel that the information, the engagement is coming together and small changes are afoot. There are little behavioral changes. Some carbon is being saved. There is some hope. But the scale doesn't seem to be big enough. We sort of feel that this is all very well, but is it really going to help? So what we're looking for is something much bigger, and for that I think we need two things. we need whatever changes are made through this information, through this engagement, through this influence, they have to be habitual. They have to become things that actually are part of what we do without thinking. And they also have to begin to spread beyond ourselves. I won't spend too long on beyond the individual social brain point. That's now the project I lead. I'll say a few things about it, but John's already spoken about it and Dan has, so I'll try and avoid too much duplication. Just to say that the model of the individual, of course, is central to our whole society, and when it collapses, something needs to come in its place. And one of the reasons it's so robust and resilient is that the alternative model isn't yet parsimonious enough, clear enough, coherent enough to be a fully viable alternative. It's emerging, we're beginning to get hold of it, but we'll fall back on what we know. It's literally a case of better the devil you know, in some ways. I think there's a book called Zombie Economics, which speaks to what John was talking about earlier, which basically says, yeah, everyone knows that this thing is dead, but it lives nonetheless. Now, this is about reflexivity, which is very core to the RSA's work in our projects. Reflexivity is essentially a concept that I think matters crucially now. Climate change was going on before we really knew about it. Now that we know about it, our very perception of who we are and how we should act has changed. Social networks were always there, but there's now a science of social networks, and it's beginning to change our perception of how we should act and what matters to us. Neuroscience, well, that's a bit more recent, but we've always had brains. It's just that we've become a bit more aware of what they are and what they're for. And reflexivity is this process through which we reflect on the conditions of our action, whether it's climate change, whether it's networks, whether it's neuroscience. And just by reflecting on those conditions, our very activity changes. So there's this ongoing dynamic process. I used a quote from Ian McGilchrist because I think I wanted everyone just to know about him and his book, The Master and His Emissary, which, if you haven't read already, please do. That was the only message I could impart by coming across the Atlantic. It would be worth it. He actually answers the question that was posed earlier to me when I was speaking after Dan's talk. Deanna Rose said to me, how do we get this way? How did it get to be that we were so self-interested? We had this model that's so much not the truth about who we are. And actually, McGilchrist answers it very powerfully with a model of actually the hemispheric difference in the brain and how that relates to cultural evolution. And he does it, to my mind, very beautifully, very persuasively. And it explains why we're caught in what he calls a hall of mirrors, in which we have this view of the rational, self-interested individual. And we can't quite shake it because somehow we become accustomed to only thinking in terms of what's measurable, what's abstract, and what's controllable, when the things that matter to us are none of those things. As I say, I won't go into this because it could take a whole hour, but the social brain argument is vast. I mean, it comes from a multitude of disciplines. There are many points there that haven't yet been touched upon. The only one that I think is worth raising that maybe hasn't been touched upon yet is why we have consciousness at all. Because so much of our motor control, so much of what we do naturally in terms of navigating our lives is automatic. I think there's a professor of social psychology at Florida called Barg, I forget his first name, but he says that 99% of our behavior is automatic. He wrote a paper called The Unbearable Automaticity of Being, which developed that idea. But there's also people like Bauermeister who come back and say, no, conscious thought is pretty important. We need consciousness for various things. And one of his main arguments is that we need consciousness really for social reasons. That actually it's because we have access to our own thoughts that we can think sequentially, that we can have theory of mind, insight into other people's minds, and also because we can think and be aware of our own thoughts, other people can read our thoughts and interact with us on that basis. And then all the others, which I think we've already touched on today. There are many different ways of getting the social brain point, but this is the one that spoke to me personally. It's just the fact that we have whites in our eyes. And why do we have that? Well, it's so that people can read our eyes. And why do they do that? Because that's a way of reading your thoughts. It's simple, but actually humans are really the only ones who have the sclera and the whites of the eyes to that degree. I'm sure Dan can speak to this in more detail and with more refinement, but this point really brought it home to me in a sense, that you can follow someone's gaze because they have whites in a way you can't otherwise. You can't, the head may move, but in some ways it's beautiful, the fact that just by moving your eyes, you're communicating to somebody. They follow your gaze, they know what you're looking at, you're communicating. And that's possible because of this feature. Okay, networks are the main subject, so very briefly on habits. Habits are crucially important, but to explain this fully, we need to speak about automatic system of the brain, conscious system of the brain, the environment, and much else besides. So a quick run-through of habits. Most of our life is a process of creating habits for ourselves, and actually it's a very adaptive process. It's a process we do because that allows us to live our lives, and it frees up consciousness for important stuff, frees up consciousness for the surprises that come our way all the time. However, we have bad habits, and a lot of those bad habits are causing the climate problem. So the question is, how do you go about changing them? And in some of the work we did at the RSA, just sharing some of this knowledge with the general public, they said the most liberating piece of knowledge for them was the idea that getting over habits wasn't just about willpower. It wasn't just that you were somehow a wretched creature who couldn't control yourself. That actually coming to understand habituation, the process of habituation, realizing it's a very human trait, and realizing that it's very closely linked to your habitat. Here we are in a certain habitat. It frames the conditions of what we're doing somewhat. Everywhere does, your office, your home, your car. Your habits are framed by your habitat. We know from lots of evidence that willpower is scarce. If you resist the, the second cup of coffee in the morning, you'll struggle with the cake at lunchtime and have real difficulty with the pizza at dinner time. It runs out, and that's a scientific notion. It's not just a sort of conceptual heuristic. And I think that matters because we shouldn't think that changing behavior is about us and our own willpower. We should realize that we have to shape the world around us in a certain way to bring out the best in ourselves. That means shaping the environment, it means shaping our relationships, and so forth. And of course, social networks are a huge part of that. The biggest part of our habitat. The habitat here is defined by who's here, and by the beautiful surrounds as well. Now, the problem with networks, I think, is that when you speak about them, I occasionally get this massive wave of enthusiasm from people who go, yeah, networks, somehow we can use them, we can harness them, we can marshal them, we can, they use the word cascades of behavior change across networks. But there's also some people who are a bit more skeptical and say, well, look, don't networks just amplify what's already there? Aren't networks just a sort of a device by which you make things bigger? Weren't there networks in Nazi Germany? Are networks really something that is a sort of value-neutral notion, or is it something that actually we should see as inherently useful, inherently valuable? The mafia, of course, have had huge networks, and that's how they keep their power. So Christakis' point here is a very important one to consider. I am not too sure what I think about it, but I'm broadly in agreement, which is the notion that there's something about recognizing the social nature of human beings that brings with it an acknowledgement that we're best when we're with other people. And so therefore there is something, I think, normative about the idea that forging networks, making bonds, moving towards the we and away from the me, is actually a normative process of value, something that's good. But nonetheless, we should be aware that not all networks are good. It's not like networks are going to save the world. It's whatever changes we make ourselves can be amplified through those networks. They're a way of accelerating, a way of magnifying, but in themselves they won't solve the problem. Neural basis for contagion is worth briefly touching on. I mentioned already that why we care about networks is because we care about contagion. We care about things spreading through networks. And there seems to be a very good basis for this in two different systems of the brain. Mirroring system we've heard about already. As I understand it, then mirror neurons haven't yet been discovered in humans, but they've been discovered in monkeys and corroborated by lots of social.
UCLA, we just found them in humans.
Oh, really? Brilliant. Okay, even better. So it's even stronger.
You just found what?
In open skull surgery, the mirror neurons were actually found in human living brain.
Right. And this is quite hot off the press, right? This is quite recent, I think, yeah. So we've known for a while that there are mirror neurons in monkeys, and we've also known that through studies of social cognition, you can see people copying each other's behavior. So we put two and two together and assumed humans had mirror neurons, and now it seems like we know. And this is the main mechanism through which contagion happens. But not just anything is contagious. This is one of the challenges we're going to face. We'll come to that in a second. Mentalizing system is also a process through which we begin to read others' minds, interpret what they're thinking and feeling. And through that process, we get some feeling for their attitudes and values, and therefore these things also shift. Now, we've given this overview of social brain in social networks. The problem is we still do a lot of our research as if we were dealing with individual units. There's often an implicit framing of what they call methodological individualism, which is that you study the individual and then you aggregate out, whether in statistical terms or in other explanatory terms. And one of the main values of thinking in terms of the social brain is this reunion of the social and psychological. Someone earlier this morning said, I'm a psychosocial researcher, and I thought, great, because we need more of them. This divide between psychological and social, in my view, is entirely an artifice. But there's also a need for, the idea that research is going to solve the climate problem seems foolish because it's too urgent. But there is a sense in which, at the moment, studying social networks and studying social contagion is very, very difficult. And we need better models, both theoretically and empirically and practically, because we need to measure these networks as they're shifting over time. Because social networks, of course, are not static. They move as people move. And they're never stable because they depend upon individuals who can live and die or who can move away or break off their friendships. So I think anyone out there who can find devices to, for example, quickly capture what is the network in this room, who is central to the network, who is peripheral, who has access to another group that no one else has access to, who can act as a bridge between other groups of people. There are many different ways of measuring and things we want to know, but it would take us many days to find out at the moment. We need much quicker methods of detecting it. And that can come about. There is some early signs with certain technologies that can use GPS spatially with some basic form of social network analysis. And we're hoping this will take off, but it hasn't yet. So quickly what we did in London, and the reason I think some of you who read the Connected Communities report will know this already, we felt that there's a lot of studies on online data because you can, basically. That's people follow the trail where they can get the papers out. And there's quite a lot of organizational studies because it's funded by big organizations who want to know how they can be more productive and profitable. Both of these things are important, and we've learned a lot about social network structures from them. But doing unbounded social networks and communities is another matter entirely. It creates a lot of methodological problems, a lot of practical problems. But we think that perhaps it's even more important because the kinds of behavior change we care about, the kinds of contagion that matter, are often the kinds that involve seeing other people put up a solar panel, for example. What is, in classical economic terms, that's a question of incentive. How much did it cost? How much will it save you? But in social brain terms, that's a question of observing an action, feeling something in relation to it, and simulating the possibility of copying it yourself. Yeah, sure. So, I've covered all that. The problem with social network analysis, as I've already said, is not so easy to do. Of course, you can begin to dig down into this. The different colors correspond to different areas. You begin to see how they cluster. You begin to form conclusions about strengths and weaknesses of networks in different areas. But I just highlight this to say that social networks matter hugely. We kind of know this, we get this, but we don't yet seem to have the techniques that allow us to study it quickly enough and effective enough to make the change in climate terms that would matter to us. I won't go into this too much because it's in the report, but there are lots of things about networks that people ought to know. The structure matters, even if you don't know exactly what's in it. So you can have scale-free networks where you have a particular person who's very, very powerful and opens doors to other people. And without that person, you can't get access to them. There are random networks, a bit like the one you just saw, where it's very hard to give it any structure. And the core of the contagion argument is expressed by Kostakis and Fowler as being a 3-degree of influence rule. They claim that their network studies tell us that whether it's happiness, obesity, loneliness, or smoking cessation, I think those are the 4 they've done, your influence extends to 3 degrees. So what you do affects what your friend's friend's friend does. I think on the cover of the book it says, it turns out that your wife's husband's sister, so your colleague's husband's sister can make you fat even if you've never met her. And that's probably not strictly true, but that's how they sold the books. And the reason it's not strictly true is recently there have been quite a lot of studies, for the statisticians in the room, you'll appreciate this, that it's very hard to disaggregate what's a real network effect, what's an effect of me causing your behavior to change from what they call a homophily effect, just a manner of birds of a feather flock together. It's not that I caused you to change, it's just that your behavior change is correlated to mine. They happen at the same time, but one didn't cause the other. And it's really difficult to tease them out, and a recent paper actually suggests that Kostakis and Fowler's 3 degrees rule might be a slight exaggeration. It might be more like 2 or 2 and a bit, that actually we don't know for sure how powerful this effect is. Weak ties matter a lot. In fact, the reason we come to conferences like this is because of weak ties. It's because people we've never met before, suddenly we have a connection with. It's not a massive connection, we haven't been lifelong lovers or friends, but suddenly you know them and you have a common point of contact, and through that you have access to all the people they know. And this is an aspect of group-forming networks. You're not just individuals, you're all members of groups, and I'm a member of many groups too. So by connecting to you, I connect to all of your groups and vice versa, which is why networks have the potential to grow exponentially. And if we believe in this phenomenon of contagion, and we believe in group-forming networks, then it's quite empowering, because it means that whatever change you make potentially has a massive impact. The issue of me to we quickly in network terms, not so much in awareness brain terms, but there is something to be said for just weaving networks together. There is a role for people out there. I think Obama was a community organizer and mocked for that. But actually, a lot of what he did was network weaving. He brought together people with common problems. I think someone actually said the day before the election, the Republicans want to know what a community organizer does. Well, tomorrow they're going to find out. And I think that really spoke to me when I was considering this work, because it's a wonderful model by Hudson Crawley. They use it in practical terms in communities. And they begin with scattered fragments of small groups, and they gradually build it up. They have core hubs. So this is a hub. The Garrison Institute is a place where you're all coming together. There are spokes to that. After a while, there may be multiple hubs. Small clusters will form together and get together. And then after a while, you should hopefully have a core of multiple hubs, and also quite a strong periphery of small groups as well. Quickly on this quote, and then we'll sum up on what it means for climate change. Networks are uncertain. They're nonlinear systems. Cause does not always lead to effect in a predictable way. Policymakers want clear levers. They want predict, plan, and control. Networks don't really give you that. They have emergent properties that we can't fully understand or even control. So they're very powerful. As Ormerod says here, there's no point in ignoring them. They're a big part of our society and how the world really works. But we also need to be humble about it and realize that if we're going to engage with them and try and make network-based interventions, it's not going to be easy to determine what the outcome will be. So accountability shifts and everything else. OK, 2 quick ideas that might come back in the discussion. It's not clear if there's anything about climate-related carbon abatement behavior that lends itself particularly well or particularly badly to contagion. We have to be open to the fact that some things can spread better than others. So things that are very easily observed physically through patterns of imitation spread better than things that are in the mind, attitudes, habits. A study of another think tank in London by Demos showed that trust in politicians didn't really spread across networks. It didn't really matter if your friends trusted your politicians. It didn't have any effect on you. So we've got to be a bit balanced about this. And finally, the issue of in-group, out-group problems. Network weaving has a role to play there. We just actively seek out the people that we don't know yet in any given group or area. Like, we're quite a homophilous group. We might come from a diverse set of backgrounds, but our values and concerns are very similar. And in some ways, if we're going to actually move beyond talking to each other and getting ideas, we need to speak to the enemies too. We need to have much more bridging rather than just bonding that we get here. And that's it. Thanks very much.